Hi, I'm Alicia. I work for a mainstream news organization too, and I'm really curious. You talk about objectivity, and and that being a concern, and obviously discussing that when you're making a decision in terms of covering religion. But I'm curious how you determine and how you distinguish, particularly in this age of news where POV is so forthcoming. In your face and seen as the right thing to do or the way to go. Where does objectivity end and insight begin? Because oftentimes, to your point, that can be helpful. And even like you say, you don't know what you don't know if you're not a part of that group to even know that that's something newsworthy to take note of. Let's say the way someone talks. So I'm curious how you balance the two of those, and even in just who you assign to a story, where that can be useful.
So your question is, where does objectivity and sort of insight sort of begin? And
I'm just curious the process in terms of how you're making those determinations of when that insight is useful versus when it might be a bias.
Right.
What are the kind of questions, as editors, you all are asking, and maybe that's still a process being determined. And
yeah, I mean, obviously we do wrestle with these kind of things. I mean, it's interesting. There was back in the day, if you had ever worked on a political campaign, for example, that would be a big no-no in terms of hiring you, or it'd be at least a major question. And somebody had actually, a lot of times I get questions from younger people wondering, should I do this or what's the career path or whatever. And some people have asked, if I worked on a political campaign, is that going to hurt, my ability to get into journalism? And interestingly, so I guess that's a statement about, so interestingly, I think it matters a lot less now.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a statement of sort of where we are, I guess, where it's much more common these days for people to sort of go back and forth. There's less of a sort of a dividing line. I don't know. I mean, I guess as an editor, so if I had signed a reporter to something and I knew that they had some sort of background that, I don't know. I mean, what's a good example of this? Okay, so I'm Asian American, so I'm going to send another Asian American reporter to cover, I don't know, just randomly make up an example. Like there were race riots in Los Angeles or something like that, and you want to send another Korean reporter or something like that. To the Koreatown or something like that. So you would probably want to send that reporter because they speak Korean maybe, or they the fact that they are Asian will probably help them sort of a little bit in bridging sort of divides. But then obviously you got to be sort of worried about are there going to be biases or whatever. But again, I guess I feel like we can rely upon the sort of the apparatus, this infrastructure of newspapers, which I think is actually a big difference between, if you go to a website like a BuzzFeed or like a Politico or something like that, while they do have, strong standards, and I respect Politico and BuzzFeed and all these sort of websites out there, they have much less by way of editing and copy editing and sort of layers. And so when you're at the New York Times, there's so much of an infrastructure of, okay, so there's going to be an editor who edits they call it backfielder, who sort of do the first edit. There's going to be a copy editor that gets passed to. There's going to be a slot copy editor who sort of is back reading on that. There's going to be other sort of bigger editors who are sort of also back reading. And I think the belief is that those layers should be able to sort of catch those issues. Do we not? Do we screw up sometimes? Yeah, because a lot of times this stuff is on deadline. It's happening very fast, and but I think that's actually one thing that newspapers like the New York Times still continue to bring, is that we have these sort of layers. We have a giant copy desk. We haven't. Like a lot of these websites with the emphasis on speed, there is no copy editor. There might be a light line edit, and then they'll put it up. And so there's a lot more sort of room for sort of mistakes, I think. And I guess I would just sort of hope that You know, obviously we would have to make, it's hard to sort of, for me to sort of talk about it without sort of knowing that, like a very specific situation and how I would handle it. But I guess in general I would err on the side of like, if I think somebody could bring something to something that could help them report the story, you know, I would want them to bring whatever that they could bring, you know. And then in terms of the sort of fear from bias, yeah, there are times we might excuse a reporter from covering something. You know, if it involves a family member or like, you know, something like that, like, I don't know. There are plenty of circumstances where we would do it. But I guess I think in general we would generally trust the professionalism of the reporter and trust that the sort of apparatus of the New York Times would catch it. I think that's the answer.
Thank you.
I'm sort of curious, is there any subject, Mike, that you would want to recuse yourself from covering if you were assigned that you feel, or?
Well, I mean, I wrote that story about Redeemer and Tim Keller, but I wasn't a member of Redeemer. I didn't go to Redeemer at that point, and I wouldn't have done the story, you know, if I was. So that would be an example where it's sort of too close, and I think others would probably say the same thing. I mean, again, it's case by case, so it's hard to sort of draw like a complete. You know, say only this circumstance, that circumstance.
Hi.
Question over here.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. I was wondering, maybe you don't want to say, but what is the worst mistake in your perspective that you think you've made, and how did you recover from it?
Oh, I've made?
Yeah. Or that you've been responsible for.
The worst mistake that I've made.
So we can learn from you.
Well, I haven't made any career-ending ones yet. I don't know, because I'm thinking about like, you know, if you, there have been like good journalists who have made like, you know, really serious, like an example that comes to mind. I don't remember the exact circumstances. This was not me, but like somebody came. We wrote a whole story about somebody I think who was supposed to be somebody who was recovering from, or refugee from like Katrina or something like that. And we wrote this whole really sad story about it, and it turned out the person had completely misled us, and the reporter, and it was a complete fiction. But that reporter is still at the New York Times, and like, and obviously there were sort of consequences, repercussions. A lot of it might not have been, you know, there are certain things that we could have done perhaps to sort of push to double check. But anyways, I'm trying to think of like a.
Well, here's maybe a follow-up that might help John a little bit. We had a midterm exam in Intro to Journalism this week, and I'm not going to name names of students, but there were a few on the story they had to write, which was a redo of a Pulitzer Prize story from 1961, Death at the Opera. So in the story they wrote, there were a few names misspelled. And I was trying to impress this week what happens inside a newspaper when even something like a name is misspelled. And can you give us a picture inside the New York Times? What a correction, when a correction happens, what happens to you? And
well, that's definitely part of the, especially after the Jason Blair thing, there became like a big sort of, it became a much bigger focus on corrections and, you know, making sure we corrected things and having a culture, sort of re-emphasizing that we need to have a culture of being openness, but also, but it was much more that if corrections, you have a lot of corrections, that's going to reflect on your evaluation, and you know, it's going to reflect on sort of, you know, whether you could even stay at the New York Times. I think, you know, there have been some reporters who have had issues with a lot of corrections, and that's definitely. You know, big no-no, and it's definitely something that when you screw something up, like spell somebody's name wrong, you know, I think I once, like, you know, I don't know, this is not a big, I once thought it's called like I said in a story, a member of Congress, I said he was a Democrat when he was a Republican. So like, you know, I was on deadline, and really embarrassing. So I don't know, you could do a Nexus search of Michael Luo and correction or something, and you'll see all my corrections. Fortunately, as an investigative reporter, I don't write stories as often, and now I'm an editor, and I don't write, so you won't find many recently. So, but there have definitely been times I've sweated it. You'll get on this bad run, and certain people are better with attention to detail than others, and I think I'm not as good at attention to detail. I'm not super, meticulous, and I've screwed things up, like things like age and misspelling somebody's name, but we obsess about it. And a good example is the New York Times takes really seriously being the paper of record, and there was a the movie 12 Years a Slave. So it came it came out when won the Best Picture. Somebody sort of the article that in the New York Times about I forget the guy's name, Solomon Winthrop or something. I forget his name. He came up and it was sort of circulating. This was the sort of story in the New York Times about this man who was forced to become a slave, and it turned out we had misspelled his name, and so we corrected it 150 years later.
And I can only imagine on the investigative team at the Times that the NRA or other groups or anybody on the wrong side of your story is going to be going through with a fine-tooth comb,
right,
not only looking for name misspellings, but anything that they could perceive as something wrong, that they could get a correction, because that is a victory.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, you saw that happen with that story that happened recently with Christie and the bridge, and we put up a very fast story about there was just sort of a slight nuance that we kind of got wrong in the lead, and the Christie people jumped on it, and in this sort of day and age of war rooms, rapid response, they had a lot of ammunition to sort of fight back, and it sort of stepped on sort of the bigger picture, which was that he had some contradictions in his story. But so that's a good example of how correction can really hurt.
Yeah. So. More questions? We've got a few minutes left. Carly?
Thank you for joining us. My question is just, do you think that the secular reputation of the New York Times has caused maybe younger Christians who are graduates of journalism, kind of caused them to shy away from applying to the New York Times or aspiring to that? I mean, it has a great reputation in the secular community, but do you see that as harmful?
I don't know. It's possible, I guess. I think the reason, in terms of why is there, goes back to the very complicated reason of okay, so why is there not more Christians at the New York Times? Well, like I said, I said in the talk, it's like a lot of other sort of elite sort of institutions filled with a lot of people from elite colleges and, come from, very cosmopolitan sort of, there's a sort of certain type, I guess. And so those places, go to Harvard, you go to the New York Times, you go to Goldman Sachs, Christians are not sort of the majority or whatever, and so there's sort of that's just that general sort of thing. It's also incredibly hard to be hired at the New York Times, especially recently. In the last couple of years, we just generally in the past have had this sort of, you come in, young reporters come in on the Metro desk, you sort of pay your dues, go through your paces, learn how to be a reporter, and then you go on and be a national correspondent, foreign correspondent, Washington, whatever. And lately, in the last couple of years, as the recession has really shrunk, hurt hiring, and we've sort of fallen down on the hiring younger people thing, and we've basically hired superstars. So we hire Anthony Shadid from the Washington Post. We hire, some big political reporter or something, or so then you're dealing with, okay, who are those people you're hiring? And I guess it's the same situation. You're hiring from big institutions like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and they probably have the same sort of issue. I don't know. I mean, so is the reason that there aren't more? I don't even really know if you're. I mean, so it was part of the I don't really know this from an HR perspective. It's probably illegal to ask, like, are you a Christian hiring or whatever. So that whole issue of, like, you know, trying to hire for a broad cross section of America is something I think the Times is, you know, continually sort of struggling with, and the challenge is even greater in this era where we don't hire very often. And so,
Can you see that shift taking place?
where more Christians are coming, it's well, I guess it's hard to imagine. I guess it's hard to imagine, mainly because, well, I mean, you got then you're talking about, like, producing a lot more. I don't know. I don't even really know the numbers of young Christian journalists. I don't think it's probably that high. So then you're talking about a pretty small pool of people trying to get them into the New York Times. It's a pretty tough road. I remember one time I tried to get Paul hired. So.
Yeah, I remember. I just got a promotion. I probably should have listened more. But I just got a promotion. I didn't jump at the opportunity. I think, you know, on that strain, and I'm going to go to Terry Manning with a question. On that strain too, the best way to get to the New York Times is how Mike did, by just being a good Christian, a good journalist, and doing great stories. And then if God sees fit and your career sees fit, that's where you end up. That's just maybe one synthesizing remark there. Terry.
Yeah, I don't think it has helped that very few Christian colleges have taken journalism seriously for decade after decade. When I first started looking into that in the early 90s, I think I found 5 people on faculty of major Christian schools who had ever published a lead in a mainstream newspaper. And so to some degree the fault's on us as well. Well, you're probably not going to be surprised to know I wanted to ask about the Bill Keller quote. I realized that Bill Keller was not editor of the New York Times when he made his famous statement in Austin. He'd been out of office, so to speak, for 3 days. And he was asked, does the New York Times slant the news to the left? And he said, other than on issues of culture and social issues. And he cited in particular gay rights, evolution, and a couple of other things related to religion. He said, other than moral and cultural issues, I don't think we slant the news.
I don't remember the exact quote, but when was this?
This was like 3 days after he left office. LBJ Library. The video is still online if you want to see it.
Okay. Okay. So
I thought it was the most important statement that's been made in American journalism in quite a while. Because basically what he essentially said was, we try to get our political coverage fair, but on moral and social issues and religious issues, we don't try. We don't try anymore.
I don't think that's true. But there's a greater danger in those issues. You know, like, again, because of the sort of, you don't know what you don't sort of really know, and then this whole issue of sort of worldviews. And so, I'm just thinking carefully here.
I didn't want you to have to answer this one on the record.
Right. So, you know, okay, so keeping in mind also that, with the caveat that not all, that, like I said, I've said this several times at the top, evangelical, one of my biggest peeves is that evangelical is a theological orientation, it's not a political one.
Right.
So evangelicals are across the spectrum on these issues, including gay marriage, including, you know, a lot of this sort of, you know, hot button sort of issues. So when New York approved gay marriage, I remember, you know, on Twitter, I actually think tweeted something about, like, journalists need to be careful at this moment, because, you know, there was sort of, and I'm not saying necessarily specifically at the New York Times, I'm talking about, like, I'm on Twitter and I follow a ton of people, most of them journalists, and there was sort of I was seeing people celebrating, and I think at one point I talked to somebody about it sort of offline, and his reaction was, at first he actually didn't know why I was cautioning him, and so then I said, well, obviously we don't tell people who we vote for. We don't tell what political party we belong to, and same goes to like where we stand on this issue. And he sort of realized, oh yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. I have to be careful. So I guess that's a little bit indicative, because I think there was a sort of a little bit of a feeling of they didn't fully realize that they were doing something potentially wrong. And so then that comes from sort of a blinder on that issue of like, okay, the issue is only really seen one way. And so I think there could be a potential for a lot of people, other people in the newsroom to, again, because if they're not exposed to people with other sort of viewpoints, they just don't really know that there is another side, I guess. And so you're right that it is an area that is probably the most dangerous and sort of the one that we have to be the most careful about. But I would not say that we have given up on trying on it, because, again, we agonize, including on these sort of like, sensitive issues, about getting it right. And I've been in the room where with editors where they're sort of agonizing over phrases and are we doing this fairly? And I think the same would apply on that issue. That's what I would say.
This gets into, hopefully the students are thinking of the media theory classes, right? And does the newspaper reflect the news? Does it give you what you want or what you need? Is it supposed to mirror? It can't be a mirror to everybody. Yeah. And I just want to say thanks to Mike for standing up. And I didn't know some of the stuff that you do behind the scenes there, but as a loyal New York Times reader, I wanted to start keeping a box now as a faculty member, that when I see a story about a Christian person or institution that I think is done well, I want to save that, because I think sometimes we often curse when the mirror doesn't reflect what we want. But maybe we don't save a story like on David Wise, the young skier who won a gold medal and is a devoted Christian, and there was a wonderful profile of him in the Times sports section about him and his faith. I got time for, I think, one more question here from Jan. I think Jan had his hand up first.
Okay.
And
well, I've asked a question already, so maybe someone hasn't.
There's a couple student questions. It's up to you if you want to yield to
this was a follow-up.
Okay, let's go to Jan, and the students Mike will have a little bit of time to chat too when we're finished here, okay?
Just following up.
Please don't follow up.
In a different way. I think it's
you don't have
understood,
to answer, Mike.
Right.
I think it's understood that at the Wall Street Journal, there's a clear line between the news side and the editorial side of the paper. How strong is that line? How much is it emphasized at the New York Times?
I guess I'm surprised that you would say at the Wall Street Journal there's a clear line.
Well, at least they say so.
Well, I mean, it's a humongous dividing line. The New York Times. I mean, and actually that's kind of shocking that like some people don't know that. Like the editorial board, like and you see those unsigned editorials on the editorial page. That's written by the editorial board of the New York Times, which is a completely different entity from the newsroom. They're on a different floor. Like we don't interact with them. We don't know what they're writing about. And there is a very sort of it's like the separation of church and state. Like it's like there's a very sort of high bar. And actually, this is where I think that sometimes we don't do a good enough job explaining ourselves in sort of this era of where there's a lot of sort of skepticism in the media. I was actually talking to a friend of mine from Harvard, highly educated guy, really successful venture capital guy, and he messaged me. He's like, and he didn't know that, he thought that like the reporters wrote the editorials, and he had wondered about at one point, and he didn't know like really basic things. Like he's like, why is Nick Kristof, you know, cheering about Obama? Isn't he like? So you're telling me he's, you know, like there's, you know, they're not supposed to have opinions and report. I was like, Nick Kristof is an op-ed columnist. He's supposed to have opinions, you know, and he didn't really sort of understand that there was a difference. So there's a lot of sort of basic, you know, things that, you know, I guess I'm surprised that a lot of people don't know, but maybe we should do a better job explaining. So.
Yeah, it's maybe a society issue. And I can say, by the way, for the Wall Street Journal, when we were at Liberty Street, 200 Liberty Street, near here, the editorial page had its own glassed office, different entry keys, and if you had a friend on the page, if you were a reporter and you had a friend on the editorial page, it was because something, you met them on the elevator, strangely, or something. But when Rupert Murdoch bought the company, we moved to Midtown, to his building, the editorial page was among all the journalists, by the way, and there was no wall anymore. Just a fact.
Symbolic, yeah.
But I think there's a different issue. We're talking physical space. There's a different issue of bleeding into the pages or whatnot. But we can continue that maybe in our next off-record discussion. I want to respect the students here organizing the refuge meeting. So I think we need to end now. But those are the 2 or 3 of you guys who had questions. Please come up and ask Mike, okay? Thanks. Let's thank Mike for